The 19th of November, 1274, a Mongol fleet of 900 ships carrying 30,000 soldiers drops anchor in Hakata Bay on the northern coast of Kyushu, Japan's westernmost main island. By any measure, it is one of the largest amphibious operations in the history of medieval warfare. The Mongols have already conquered China, Korea, Persia, Russia, and most of Eastern Europe. They have never lost a major campaign. Japan, a chain of islands with no standing army by Mongol standards, would appear to present a manageable problem. By the following morning, the fleet is gone. This requires some explanation. To understand why the Mongols failed to conquer Japan, you first have to understand what the Mongols were and what they were not. By the 1270s, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Under Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, it stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the borders of Poland. It had conquered the Jin dynasty, the Song dynasty, the Abbasid Caliphate, and the Kievan Rus. It had administrative systems, efficient communication networks, and a military tradition built on speed, discipline, and the systematic destruction of anyone who resisted. What it did not have was a navy, not a real one. The Mongols were a steppe people. Their military genius was built around cavalry, fast-moving, mounted archers who could cover enormous distances, strike before the enemy organized a defense, and disappear before a counterattack could form. Ocean warfare required entirely different skills, different ships, different tactics, different everything. The Mongols had conquered naval powers before. The Song dynasty maintained a formidable river fleet, and the Mongols had eventually defeated it. But river warfare and open ocean amphibious operations against an island nation are not the same problem. The Mongols, to their credit, understood this. They simply believed they could compensate for it with sufficient numbers and borrowed expertise. When Kublai Khan decided to add Japan to his empire in the 1260s, he began, reasonably enough, by sending diplomatic missions. Japan, under the nominal authority of the emperor but effectively governed by the Kamakura shogunate, received several of these missions and ignored all of them. This was not an oversight. The Japanese were aware of what had happened to every other polity that had ignored Mongol demands. They ignored them anyway. By 1274, Kublai Khan had run out of patience. He assembled a force of roughly 30,000 soldiers, Mongols, Chinese, and Koreans, loaded them onto 900 ships largely crewed and built by Koreans, and sent them to explain the situation more directly. The first invasion landed at Hakata Bay on the 19th of November. The samurai defenders who met them on the beach discovered fairly quickly that Mongol warfare was not what they had been trained for. Japanese martial tradition at this period emphasized individual combat, formal challenges, single combat between named warriors, personal honor expressed through face-to-face engagement. The Mongols fought in tight, coordinated formations, used explosive projectiles, deployed poisoned arrows, and advanced in disciplined units that paid no attention to individual challenges whatsoever. The samurai, fighting as individuals against an organized military machine, were pushed back. By nightfall, the situation on the beach was not encouraging for the defenders. The Mongol forces had established a beachhead, inflicted significant casualties, and showed no sign of the individual combat protocols the Japanese were accustomed to. Japanese commanders pulled their forces back from the shore. Then, the weather intervened. A severe storm, by some accounts a typhoon, by others simply an autumn gale of considerable force, struck Hakata Bay. Overnight, the Korean sailors who understood the risks of remaining at anchor in an exposed bay during such conditions convinced the Mongol commanders to withdraw the fleet to open water. In the process, the storm destroyed approximately 200 of the 900 ships and killed somewhere between 13,500 men. The fleet withdrew to Korea. Japan was, for the time being, unconquered. The shogunate drew several conclusions from this. The first was that the Mongols would return. The second was that fighting them on the beach using traditional samurai methods had not worked especially well. The third was that something should be done about both of these problems before the inevitable second attempt. There was also the question of credit. The samurai families who had fought at Hakata Bay expected the traditional reward for military service: land grants, recognition, compensation for losses. The shogunate, which had no conquered territory to distribute and whose treasury had been substantially depleted by the emergency, found this expectation difficult to satisfy. The financial and political consequences of the first invasion would create tensions that lasted for decades, but that was a domestic problem. The more immediate problem was the second invasion, which everyone understood was coming. Over the following 7 years, the Japanese built a stone defensive wall along the shoreline of Hakata Bay, approximately 20 kilometers long, between 1 and 3 meters high, designed to prevent a landing force from establishing a beachhead. They reorganized their military response, training units to fight in formations rather than as individuals. They maintained a constant coastal watch. They did everything, in short, that a competent military administration would do when given 7 years' warning of an imminent invasion. Kublai Khan, for his part, was assembling the largest naval invasion force the medieval world had ever seen. The second invasion, in 1281, came in 2 separate fleets. An eastern fleet of 900 ships carrying 40,000 soldiers sailed from Korea. A southern fleet of 3,500 ships carrying 100,000 soldiers sailed from southern China. The combined force of 140,000 men was intended to be overwhelming. It very nearly was. The eastern fleet arrived first and attempted to land at Hakata. It found the defensive wall. The wall worked. For approximately 6 weeks, the Mongol forces attempted to establish a proper beachhead and were repeatedly repelled by Japanese defenders fighting from behind fortifications. The southern fleet, delayed by logistics and weather, arrived late and anchored in a farther south bay. The 2 fleets eventually consolidated near Takashima Island, unable to make significant progress against the shore defenses, waiting for an opportunity. The opportunity did not arrive. Instead, on the 23rd of July, 1281, a typhoon of considerable severity struck the Japanese coast. It lasted 2 days. When it was over, the Mongol fleet had effectively been destroyed. Contemporary Japanese sources claim that approximately 4,000 ships were sunk and between 60 and 90,000 men killed, from drowning, exposure, and the subsequent slaughter of survivors who made it to shore. The figures are almost certainly exaggerated, as medieval casualty figures tend to be, but the scale of the disaster was unquestionable. The survivors who reached the shore were, with few exceptions, killed or enslaved. The Japanese called the storms Kamikaze, divine winds. The interpretation was straightforward. The gods had protected Japan from foreign conquest through supernatural intervention. This was, theologically speaking, a satisfying explanation. It was, militarily speaking, somewhat incomplete.
The typhoons were real and decisive, but they were not the only reason the invasions failed. The Mongol forces had been held at the wall for 6 weeks before the second storm struck. Japanese resistance had been organized, effective, and considerably more competent than the first invasion might have suggested. The defensive wall had functioned exactly as intended. The reorganized samurai units had prevented a beachhead from being established. Had the typhoon not arrived, the outcome would have been far from certain. Kublai Khan planned a third invasion. He ordered the construction of new ships, the assembly of new forces, the reorganization of the Korean logistics base. It never happened. A combination of internal rebellions in China, ongoing wars in Southeast Asia, the catastrophic cost of the Second Fleet's destruction, and the sheer logistical difficulty of projecting Mongol military power across open ocean persuaded him, eventually, to abandon the project. Korea, which had borne much of the cost of building and crewing both fleets, was by this point in a state of considerable economic exhaustion. The appetite for a third attempt was not widespread. He died in 1294 without having added Japan to his empire. Why did the Mongols never conquer Japan? Because the ocean was not the steppe. because the skills that had made Mongol armies invincible on land, speed, mobility, coordinated cavalry, were irrelevant when the enemy sat behind a stone wall on a fortified coastline. Because the Koreans and Chinese who crewed the Mongol ships were not enthusiastic volunteers. Because the Japanese, given 7 years between invasions, used them well. And because 2 typhoons arrived at moments that were, for Japan, extremely convenient. The kamikaze explanation was simpler. It also had the advantage of making the result feel inevitable rather than contingent, a matter of divine protection rather than stone walls, reorganized tactics, and meteorological fortune. It removed the element of luck from the narrative entirely, which is always a more comfortable position for a nation to occupy in its own history. The reality was more complicated, and in some respects, more impressive. Japan had been given warning and had used it. The defensive wall was not divine intervention. It was competent military planning executed under considerable time pressure. The samurai who held the beachhead for 6 weeks against a force of 140,000 men were not protected by supernatural winds. They were disciplined, organized, and fighting behind fortifications they had built themselves. Japan was never conquered. The Mongols never tried again. The stone wall at Hakata Bay stood for centuries. Most of it is still there, which is, in a certain light, a considerably more straightforward explanation than divine intervention, though considerably less satisfying as a national myth, and therefore not the one that survived.